Yemen is a republic with a constitution that provides for a president, a parliament, and an independent judiciary. The internationally recognized government's control was limited in large portions of the country's territory due to influence exerted by the Iran-backed Ansar Allah movement, known colloquially as the Houthis, and other non-state actors. The most recent presidential election occurred in 2012, when Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi won a 2-year mandate as president. On April 7, President Hadi issued a presidential declaration transferring his powers to an 8-member Presidential Leadership Council to serve as the executive body of the government, whose members were sworn in on April 17 in Aden. The primary entities of the internationally recognized government of Yemen responsible for internal security are the Political Security Organization and the National Security Bureau. By law, both organizations report to the Interior Minister and then to the President. The Criminal Investigation Division, which conducts most criminal investigations and arrests, the Paramilitary Special Security Forces, and the Counterterrorism Unit, also report to the Interior Minister. Ministry of Defense supervised units also performed some internal security functions. Competing tribal, party, and sectarian influences reduced the government's ability to exercise authority in many areas. Houthi forces controlled most of the residual national security entities in sections of the north and other former state institutions. The government of Yemen staffed national security entities in areas under its control, although large areas under nominal government of Yemen control were effectively controlled by tribal leaders and local military commanders. The Southern Transitional Council and affiliated armed groups took responsibility for security in large areas of the south, including the government's temporary capital of Aden. Civilian authorities did not maintain effective control over security forces. There were reports that security personnel on all sides committed abuses. On April 1, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen announced a 2-month humanitarian truce between the government and the Houthis that resulted in the cessation of most military operations, although skirmishes continued in some Houthi-controlled areas. According to reporting from the United Nations and other monitoring organizations, the truce resulted in a sharp reduction in civilian casualties, increased the flow of essential goods, improved freedom of movement, and facilitated greater humanitarian access in several areas throughout the country. The truce also allowed for the resumption of commercial flights into and out of Sana'a Airport, facilitated the entry of oil tankers into the port of Hudaida, and included consultations to open roads in Taiz Governorate and other governorates. Negotiations to open blocked roads continued at year's end. International and domestic observers reported the Houthis used the relative calm of the truce to increase social controls, including imposing so-called guardianship restrictions on freedom of movement by women. The United Nations succeeded in renewing the truce twice. On October 2, the Houthis rejected a UN proposal to further extend it. Although the truce was not renewed by year's end, key truce terms continued to hold and discussions between the parties continued, with the United Nations reporting that there continued to be no major military escalation by parties to the conflict as negotiations continued toward a more durable ceasefire. Significant human rights issues by all parties to the conflict included credible reports of unlawful or arbitrary killings, enforced disappearances, torture or other cases of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, harsh and live, threatening prison conditions, arbitrary arrest and detention, political prisoners and detainees, serious problems with the independence of the judiciary, arbitrary or unlawful interference with privacy, serious abuses in a conflict, including widespread civilian harm and unlawful recruitment or use of child soldiers by all parties to the conflict, particularly the Houthis, serious restrictions on freedom of expression and media, including violence, threats of violence, unjustified arrests or prosecutions against journalists, censorship, and the existence of criminal libel laws, serious restrictions on internet freedom, substantial interference with the freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association, severe restrictions of religious freedom, restrictions on freedom of movement, inability of citizens to choose their government peacefully through free and fair elections, serious and unreasonable restrictions on political participation, serious government corruption, serious government restrictions on international human rights organizations, lack of investigation of and accountability for gender-based violence, including but not limited to domestic, intimate partner violence or both, as well as sexual violence, and child, early, and forced marriage and female genital mutilation. There were significant barriers to accessing reproductive health, existence of laws criminalizing consensual same-sex sexual conduct between adults, and existence of the worst forms of child labor. Impunity for security officials remained a problem, in part because the government exercised limited authority and failed to investigate and prosecute abuse and corruption. Houthi control over former government institutions in the north severely reduced the government's capacity to conduct investigations. The Houthis continued to benefit from confiscation of state resources, taxes on the business sector, and diversion of humanitarian assistance. The government did not undertake any significant anti-corruption activities, while the Houthis continued to misuse former anti-corruption authorities to stifle dissent and repress political opponents. Non-governmental actors, including the Houthis, tribal militias, and terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the local branch of ISIS, committed significant abuses with impunity. January was the deadliest month for civilian casualties in 3 years, which included a Saudi-led coalition airstrike that resulted in significant civilian deaths and injuries and damaged civilian infrastructure. See the country reports on human rights practices for Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. October press reports citing Oxfam noted a 60% reduction in civilian casualties during the 6 months following the start of the truce.